Welcome everyone to our Supply Chain Council webinar for today. This is the next in our series on the M4SC overview. Today we're going to be covering network management. And today presenting for us is Casper Hunche, the Research Director for the Council. As always, please type your questions into the question box that you see on your screen. We'll answer all the questions that you have today. We are also recording, and we will post this webinar recording on not only our website archive, but also it will be on our YouTube page and also on the M4SC research page, which is under resources on the Supply Chain Council website. And I think that, Casper, I'll go ahead and turn this over to you, if that's okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Welcome to the webinar about the network management layer of M4SC. Before we dive into the network layer, I would like to first take you quickly through the actual framework itself. If you consider the activities surrounding managing a supply chain, then there are several areas that basically input to that management, as well as part of the management itself. And in our kind of depiction here, what we're trying to show is, first of all, supply chain management obviously is driven from a business strategy. So the idea is that there is a certain set of rules, objectives, expectations coming out of the business, which then are translated into a specific strategy for the supply chain. And that's really our first box on the slide here, where we're saying, when you take the business strategy and take those components out of the business strategy that are important to determine supply chain strategy and translate that into very specific goals and objectives for the supply chain. So things like, what are the products that we're serving which customers with, what are expectations around performance for those customers. It's also a matter of how do you take those products from your suppliers to your customers, because you can imagine that not everybody is having the same expectations. If I order something online, I have a certain expectation which may be different from ordering something in a store, where my expectation is that I get access to the product immediately and can take it home. So companies establish supply chains based on these different kind of expectations. And an expectation is often expressed in a contractual agreement with a customer or a service level agreement. So that's really taking the business strategy and translating that into the supply chain strategy. For us, we refer to that as a manage or align strategy. That's our first layer in the M4SC framework. The second layer is the align or manage network. And that's really taking the supply chain strategy and taking that down to the next level, as into the physical layout and organization of your supply chain. So when we talk about a network and supply chain, we're really talking about the relationships between suppliers, factories, warehouses, customers, etc., and how you have organized material flows and information flows between those different parties, or nodes as we refer to them, in that network. And of course you can imagine that a business strategy which has been translated into a supply chain strategy will translate into specific strategies for unique nodes and or high-level processes in the network. And that's really what manage or align supply chain network is about. The third layer is our process layer. And in the process layer, we see that you basically take the the performance goals and expectations that come down from the business strategy through the supply chain strategy into network now to the process level. So this is really where things like process optimization are taking place. This is where you really dive into the transactional details around what the performance problems are for individual processes. So you can see how we take business strategy and cascade that down into performance objectives all the way from business to supply chain to network, now to the process level. And the final layer in the supply chain, the M4SC network, is the framework is then manage the supply chain resources. And that is making sure that you have the right resources within your supply chain designated or aligned or appointed to the right processes within the supply chain so that you get the right outcome from a performance perspective. So basically those 4 gray boxes that we highlighted here make up the M4SC framework. Today we're talking about the supply chain network management layer, and that is the layer that is going to take supply chain strategy and validate that and implement that into the way that the supply chain itself is configured. So the discussion today is going to have 5 major components. First of all, we're going to be talking about what are the type of problems that the M4SC network management processes address. So what are the typical things that companies are trying to use the M4SC network layer for? Second, we're going to look at what are some of the major components of the framework itself. So what are the key activities that we see that companies are doing in this area to make sure that they have a repeatable process for managing the network. We'll talk a bit about the drivers and then about how companies use it, and then finally, what are kind of the next steps that we foresee, because as you can imagine, this is kind of the first revision of the M4SC framework, and if you look back at the history of SCOR, then we have quite a few revisions ahead of us. So what are those common problems that we're trying to address with the M4SC framework? Well, if you look at the different layers within the framework, then one of the things that we definitely observe is that companies may spend quite a little bit of time talking about the strategy. What is the lead time that we want to service our customers with? What is the typical reliability that we expect to deliver with? What should our cost structure look like? Those kind of things are fairly getting fairly high focus. Maybe a little bit less on the how many supply chains should I have discussion, but that's what we have the strategy layer for. One thing then that companies also do very well is dive into process optimization. So they look at an individual process and say, we could do better if we just made this process better. One thing that we do see is that the layer that lays in between that, from our perspective, is often kind of ignored. And to speak with one of our instructors, she always says, well, if you ignore the supply chain network, that's like reshuffling the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. So if you see the chairs as the process layer and the Titanic as kind of the overall direction, then not thinking about what the network should look like may result in this case in, the boat still sinks because you run into an iceberg. But yeah, sure, you had the everybody sitting on a sunbed nicely. The network layer really tries to address questions like, can I really meet my performance goals? And often what we see, it's like an ad hoc afterthought, or often driven by total chaos. So, when it really goes wrong, when it's really too late, that's when we're trying to figure out what's wrong with the network. So that's kind of a key issue that we see. Another thing that we see also is that there's still an assumption that one size fits all around supply chains. So I can have one factory with one set of processes, one fulfillment route, and all my customers are going to be happy. Or maybe, well, my most important customers are going to be happy, and the rest of them have to just suffer through the process. So those are kind of issues that we're seeing as well. Another one, of course, is much more focus on keeping the status quo. We perceive that in making changes to the network, by default means like capital investments. So that's much more of a strategic thing than ever looking at tactical or execution level kind of decision making. That's not necessarily true. Not everything requires you to close a building in one place and open up a building in another place. It may be an outcome sometime in your management of network, but it's not necessarily the only solution that you can think of. So one thing that we definitely want to make sure is that we understand also who is accountable for the different nodes in the supply chain. Again, a node is a thing like a plant or a warehouse, a supplier, a customer. Who's accountable for them, and what are the kind of process level performance objectives. So those are kind of things that companies may have problems identifying what are realistic performance goals when you go a level down from like the overall performance. And that's really where the network layer also comes in. So making it measurable overall. Okay. So talking about then what the kind of the key components are of the M4SC framework at the network layer. So if you look at the typical things that we look at, first of all, we have a couple of activities that we see as kind of defining what is it that I'm looking at. So for that we see in the network layer, we see basically two key steps. One is defining what is the network that I'm looking at, and this is really things like how do I have materials flow from supplier to my plants, to my warehouses, distribution centers, etc., to my customers. And we're trying to answer the question, what do we do where, and what's the scope of our supply chain? Because of course you can expand scope as wide or as narrow as you want to. Another view of how you have organized your current state of the supply chain is also our thread diagram, which really says, okay, tell me how processes interact. So I understand that this customer talks to this warehouse or this order management facility, but what are the processes that are interacting? Because it makes a difference whether a customer exchanges forecasting information or not. These are all kind of high-level processes and connectivities that we're interested in from a network management perspective. This is not where we're diving into the detail of how do I perform an individual task within planning, or what's the algorithm that we use for allocating product to a customer. But it's more the question, where do customers and our supply chain entities interact? Where do our factories interact with our suppliers, etc. So whereas the first one looks much more at the overall material flow, the thread diagram looks much more at the process interaction. Really, at this point, we're still trying to capture the current stage. Then the question, of course, is if I understand my current stage, are there specific things that I can do to analyze its overall performance or capability? And so we see about 5 of those at the moment. The first one that we've identified is a basic ratio analysis. So ask the question, who is responsible for what within my overall supply chain? Again, this is not at the task level. I'm not asking who's entering the order in screen ABC. This is more the question of who's responsible for the performance of this plant, who's responsible for overall order fulfillment to a specific set of customers, etc. So trying to identify high-level responsibilities. We're trying to take the performance goals, etc., and start allocating those also into the overall network. Practices analysis is basically saying, if I have a set of practices which I believe are the right one for my supply chain, how am I performing against these against this list? So companies generally use words like standardization to describe this. A practice is basically saying this is a unique way of organizing a process. A practice at this level could be things like, am I taking my orders from the customer into the warehouse and fulfill them from there, make the stock, or am I taking them all the way up to the factory, maybe make the order? That's an example. Are we drop shipping them from a third party, so without ever having our own nodes touch it? So a third party directly shipping to my customers. Those are kind of things at a high level that you can look at. Am I having an overall zero inventory target for certain types of materials, those kind of things. Not necessarily practices at the detailed transactional level, like what's the EDI message for exchanging this information, etc. And the question really is, how are we doing against these standardization goals? The next one that we're seeing in there is the grid analysis. And the grid analysis basically tries to answer the question, what percentage of the customers can not meet the performance goals simply because of the way that my supply chain is organized? Because you can imagine that if you have a warehouse from which you ship to every customer, but this warehouse is 3 days away for 10% of your customers, and your performance goal is to have everything fulfilled within 1 day, then there's 10% of your customers that you will simply never be able to meet the performance goal. So that's an important question to get answered. Are we even capable of meeting overall performance goals for all the customers in my supply chain? If the answer is no to that, then you have to reconsider as part of your redesign if and how you're going to address that subset of your customers. Next then within the analysis is network decomposition, metric decomposition. This is something that really is where the strength of SCOR comes in, because this is where we can say, if I have a supply chain, which is a network or a collection of places where we perform activities, what are the locations where I see the biggest problem arise? As an example, if a simple example would be like for inventory. What are the locations where I have most of the inventory residing? What are the processes that are associated with the creation of this inventory? But you can imagine that for every type of metric that we know in the SCOR model, you can basically drill down through the metric hierarchy and say, this is where we have the problem within the supply chain arising. And the purpose there truly is to identify, where should I try and address overall performance problems. So we're trying to get from top down, overall high-level performance, down to individual areas within the supply chain that require additional attention. Then as the next step, as a final step kind of analyze then would be to look at what are the individual metrics that I actually want to pursue. I can have a large group of gaps in performance spread out through my supply chain, and some of them may have a large impact, others may have a minor impact, and the question about which ones to go after first is really what you're trying to answer in the 7th element of the framework. So what are the typical, or what are the specific, problems that I'm trying to address as part of my efforts? Then if you think about once you've done kind of the analysis around how is my supply chain performing and where am I seeing kind of the issues in performance within that overall network, then the next question, of course, is how can I fix it? And so here is really where you address coming up with unique scenarios of alternative ways to organize the network. And this is often a trial and error method, but basically, what if I added an extra warehouse closer to my customers? Okay, what would be the impact of that? What if we took a warehouse out so that we reduced inventory? What if I moved from a make-to-order to a make-to-stock environment to be able to respond faster to my customers? Again, this is another discussion about how you do it in detail. So what's the algorithm for the make-to-stock logic versus the make-to-order process, but merely identifying if I change this process where I'm no longer taking my orders through the factory, but I do it based on a forecast, what would that overall process look like? Those are all examples. You can obviously come up with many examples of your own changes that you've made in the past to your network, to your supply chain, where you're moving suppliers, you're forcing suppliers to become closer to you geographically, or you may have moved towards a supplier, may have put inventory at a customer to address problems. You may have suppliers that have put inventory on your site that they manage. Those are all kind of the high-level kind of practices that you can implement, and that's really what the network redesign tries to address. Once you've figured out, what should my network look like, and how can I maybe change individual performance goals for high-level processes, then you can also ask the question, well, what if I did this and it was the wrong decision? Well, you don't want to find out after the fact. And so the bigger the change in the network, obviously, the more of a business case you have to start considering, should we test it in somehow? How do we validate whether this scenario that we've identified, this idea, what's the impact of that? What's the feasibility? And also, what's the impact on other things? And obviously, you can imagine that there are many ways to do this type of work. One thing that we're trying to establish also as part of these communication sessions and the training is that people understand that these all are specific processes that are looking at the functionality that you need to put in place. They're not necessarily telling you in a lot of detail how you would do this, because you can imagine there are different ways to do these type of tasks. And when we start talking about the different kind of initiatives as it go forward, then we'll talk about coming up with alternative ways, practices, etc., to organize these sub-steps. So in the test network design, you're really validating kind of the ideas that you have identified and coming up with a justification that they are in fact impacting the right metrics and not negatively impacting the wrong metrics. And then as a final step within the network, we talk about the outcomes. So really, what are the key things the key changes that I want to implement? Because we all know there's a limited set of resources that we deal with. Companies can only accept so much change at the same time. So this is really the question, what are the changes that we want to go after first at the high level? You can imagine that this really drives kind of activities within the process layer. If we think in the process layer as the layer where we optimize individual processes, then a lot of the outcomes of the network layer directly influence what we do in the process layer. Here we go. So, so one of the things that we talked about that we would discuss is also the drivers. And I took the original picture from one of the first slides where we said supply chain network is driven basically on one side from the strategy layer, and on the other hand, it itself drives the strategy layer. I removed all the outputs and just looked at the inputs, because the things that really drive kind of the activities within the network layer can really be, as far as we can see at this point, driven by three kind of sources or type of inputs. The first one is kind of, if you will, the top-down. So if there are changes in the strategy, then that will obviously have an impact on the network. An example of a change in the strategy would be that we decide that we are going to be, more cost focused within the next, 12 to 18 months or 5 years, whatever the window. Basically focus on, say, okay, we need to reduce some of the cost. We have new cost targets, etc. That will drive, of course, you to relook at the network and say, are there any things that are currently happening in the network that contribute additional cost that we may need to take out, because otherwise we're not meeting our strategic goals for the supply chain. So driven from the strategy, changes in strategy will obviously have an impact on the network management layer. A second one that has an impact is much more the ad hoc. So if you think that in a scenario where there's a new competitor that suddenly entered the market and has some characteristics that your customers like very much, that you currently don't have in your supply chain, that may mean that you may have to make adjustments in the network. So if you consider that strategy may be much more of a long time activity, the events obviously are driving much more in a situation of what's happening today. So there's many different types of external influences that may drive you to reconsider changes in your network. Even as simple as a transportation company going out of business, that technically is an event that's happening that will require you to relook at your network. And then the third one that we identify is basically the feedback from the layers below it. So if you consider process and resources management activities, so if a process, for example, is given the objective to say, hey, you need to fulfill this every order within 24 hours, and the team in the process layer goes through an extensive process of identifying where they're not meeting the 24-hour deadline and doing a detailed study, and they may come back to you and say, listen, what you're asking from us is not possible. We've done the due diligence, we've gone through it. It's not possible within the parameters that you're setting, because sure, we can get everything done within 24 hours if we have unlimited funds available and unlimited staff and etc. Then we can do anything. The reality, of course, is that performance goals sit within a system that has other potentially conflicting performance goals around it. So there may be a feedback coming from, for example, the process layer, or the resource requirements cannot be met. You're asking for a certain skill set that is simply not available in the market, and there's no way to get that within the timelines that you're looking for to get that skill set built within our organization. So we may need to come up with another way to configure the network to make our overall strategic goals. So those are the three kind of inputs that we're seeing today, and hopefully as part of the M4SC development activity, there may be a lot of fine-tuning or maybe additional drivers that may be identified by our volunteer community. So then the question, of course, is, so what do companies use this for? Well, I mean, obviously the first would be, simply validating that my current supply chain configuration, my network, is still meeting performance goals. So if you just do this as an activity to make sure that you're still meeting overall goals, then that obviously is one of the more basic uses. But from that, you can derive a lot more benefit, where, for example, companies experience problems where they try to find a good way to drive strategic goals down into the organization. So how do you translate the overall strategic goal of being 95% reliable and fulfilling orders within 5 days? How do you translate that down within the organization? Well, the first step beyond setting the overall goals is obviously trying to identify how this applies to every individual node, every individual high-level process within the supply chain. So that's something that is part of managing the network. Of course, we focus on what are the responsibilities, accountabilities of the different nodes, whether it's the general manager for the factory or the director for order management. What are the responsibilities? How do we measure them? But also, who are responsible for these high-level processes within the network? And M4SC network management as a tool set obviously tries to provide a standard approach to managing network, rather than this being an ad hoc kind of approach that differs from department to department or from supply chain organization to supply chain organization. We're trying to establish kind of a standard that says, okay, these are the typical things that you go through, and then once you do that, you get a repeatable and predictable, reliable outcome. And as a last point, we can also obviously, then you can look at network management. What level of maturity have you achieved in that set of processes? So where we are today is that what we're looking at today is kind of the result of interviews with a large subset of our member practitioners, where we went through and asked them, so how do you organize, setting up strategy, how do you manage your network, etc. And we kind of cherry-picked what methods or what's repeated across many that do this activity well. From a evolution perspective, it's just the beginning. Just like SCOR 1 was the first revision of SCOR, for M4SC we're seeing the same thing. We believe that there's a lot of work that will go into the future in making this even more usable, easier to adopt, etc. And so what we're trying to address are things like, first of all, how do I sell this to my boss, right? So how do I get this adopted within my organization? We can think about measuring the effectiveness of the M4SC framework. What are best practices? So, I mean, you can imagine that a company may have a unique way of performing a subset of these tasks that applied to other companies may be considered a best practice. Automation, there is software out there from companies like Lamasoft, etc., that are specialized in network optimization activities. So that's not covering the whole thing, it's covering a subset of what we see as M4SC network today. But how do these tools integrate in this? Are they something that companies could consider? What part of this does it apply to, etc. What's the impact of risk and on the network management? What's the impact of the environment on network management? These are all things that you could see as special areas of attention that we haven't really pursued today. And so these are all things that we could see as potential areas of expansion of the M4SC framework. And of course then the last one, industry-specific needs. There may be tools, techniques, tricks that companies use in certain industries that may be limited in effectiveness to that one industry, but may actually shortcut a lot of work in other areas. So kind of leading into the kind of the volunteer activity around M4SC, I just wanted to ask Melinda, are there any questions that have been brought up so far?
Yes, I actually have several questions if you'd like to answer now.
Mm-hmm.
Are there software tools that help any of this analysis, such as grid analysis?
So are there software tools out there? No doubt. I think that's actually one of the reasons why I specifically highlighted that these are things that we want volunteers to have a look at, because some of this activity may require a lot more brain power processing than the average person may want to do. Yes, so automation is a possible answer to some of these activities. We haven't gotten a list gathered today, but that's something that's a great opportunity for volunteers to look at.
Okay, thank you. And here's a different subject. Does M4SC have a tool or a methodology for the assessment of network management capability maturity?
Do we have that today? No. But actually that would be something that we would be interested in looking at also from the perspective of how we look at the awards program within Supply Chain Council. So there is not a maturity ranking today. But you can imagine that if you start collecting different ways to do these 10 steps within the network management layer, that there is a ranking in maturity for the different ways that you can organize it.
Okay, and here's something about, well, it's a comment, I guess, more than a question. Someone is asking or proposing that it would be useful to put a time duration or a time estimate to the components in the network review.
Okay.
I don't know.
So these are all great questions for research teams, obviously. The one thing that I want to touch upon quickly on based on the last comment. The last comment seems like it's looked at from a more of a project approach perspective, because when you talk about a project environment, then you say, okay, how long is this going to take for me, etc. The idea with M4SC is that we move away from a project focus to manage the supply chain. So will supply chain management create projects? Probably, likely, yes, but management itself is not a project. And so these are in the discovery of how long these things are going to take. What we're going to find is that it much more depends on scope, etc. But it's going to be people's daily tasks, or weekly, or monthly, or quarterly tasks to perform these type of activities. Now, of course, you can look at its very specific task and say, how long does it take if I have this type of complexity? But the focus of how long do these tasks added up to each other is much more, again, reverting back to kind of a project view than a management view.
Okay. And here's a totally different question. What are the ways to test the redesigned network? Is there a best practice for simulating the new design with the real-world environmental attributes?
Right. So I would say the same answer as before, which is these are really good research projects. However, we of course know that there are some things that are happening today. If you have a very light change, then you probably want to do a quick, run through the scenario kind of thing, emulating it more in a virtual kind of talk through the process. If it's a highly complex change, then you may go as far as building a parallel environment to test it. Almost think about like doing something in a laboratory environment to recreate kind of the design, pull orders through it and see what the impact is. But you would not do that for a small change. And I think that's, so if people ask about, are there complex versions and simple versions? The answer is yes. Do you apply a complex version to a simple problem? Probably not. So you can look at it from a best practice perspective there as well.
Okay, that's everything I have right now. I probably, oh, well, never mind. Right, I've got just a second here. So supply chain network management and design has a high correlation with SNOP is the question. Should it not be viewed with an integrated view rather than a project?
I would say yes. I can't really add a lot more to it. For me, these are all research questions to go to the next level.
Okay.
How does SNOP tie into that? Is this maybe an SNOP process for some companies? I don't know. These are all excellent questions. What we try to do with the first pass of the M4SC framework is kind of say, okay, these are the things that we see companies do that do this well. So let's build upon that. And that's really a lot of these questions that have been brought up so far really ask about the specifics between one and another. And so these are really good research projects for us to do.
Okay. There's a continuation of that same question that says it makes it move in supply chain maturity from projects to integrated between source, make, deliver.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, I mean, I think that if you talk about maturity, and this is for me one of the research projects that we did talk about around, how do you do the awards program, etc. If you move from a total adhocracy into a structured approach, which comes up with, predictable outcomes, reliable new processes, reliable new supply chains, I think that is moving up the maturity ladder. The question is, are you going from a 2 to a 3 or from a 1 to a 3? I don't know. That's kind of a great set of questions to look at and see. So what would be the highest level of maturity in this case? What's the lowest level of maturity? And what are the intermediate steps? And then you could look at your own supply chain and say, well, in network we have a maturity of X. In strategy we have a maturity of Y. And in the process layer we have a maturity of Z. This is how we are currently operating. What we're trying to do with M4SC is to make people think about, how well are we doing this? Are we ad hoc? Are we somewhat repeatable? Are we, managing and optimizing this? So these are fantastic questions. Our intent is that you move up the maturity ladder away from here's another project, let's scramble, make everybody work in a tiger team and disturb the operations for a while.
Mm-hmm. Here's one about whether this would or would not be included in the network layer. The challenge influence to the network node that's not within the company control, like supplier, 3PL, subcontractor, or is that part of the network layer? I believe is the question.
So I think, you know, answering it from my view, I would say that when you look at anybody that you have contracted within your supply chain, then that is part of the network. The question, of course, is how far does your network extend or your influence extend beyond that first tier kind of partner? Because you can imagine that you can buy a service. So let's say you buy the service from somebody to assemble the product. But then the question is, who's buying the components going into that? Well, if you do that, then you have influence over that, then of course you extend the network and you extend the scope of your overall performance, the area that you want to influence, that is. So the answer is yes. How far you influence that, those are all great decisions as part of managing a network. And this was kind of the point about the boundary between risk and network management. You know, where does risk management come into network management? Because if I outsource that activity that's beyond my first tier partner, you know, what's the risk on my overall supply chain? How much does the performance of that company influence my performance? If it does, then it's probably part of your network.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. I've got another one. Maybe the supply chain network could be looked at as categories like managed, monitored, etc. is the question.
I'm not sure I understand that question, but
I can say that we'll answer it later. I think it sounds like a pretty high-level question. How to categorize parts of the network, managed network, monitor network. Let me see if it says anything.
Sounds very IT kind of focused for me, which doesn't mean that it's bad, because I think IT's been managing networks forever. So there may be some practices that we can, you know, adopt over time into this network management layer.
Mm-hmm. That's all I have for the moment.
Okay. Well, so let me complete my part then with just talking a little bit about, you know, kind of what we're doing right now. So Supply Chain Council, as a member organization, we're trying to help organizations, you know, manage supply chain better, and you know, a lot of that is driven from our volunteers, and we see that our volunteers are key participants in the research, which makes also that our products are really valuable to the practitioners. So as this webinar was part of a series of webinars that we put in place to kind of introduce people into what M4SC is. On the 18th of July, we started kind of with an all-over overview, and then on last week we started with first the strategy layer. You're listening to the network layer right now. Then next week we're doing the process layer, and on the 22nd of August we'll look at the resource layer, and on the 12th of August we'll have the introduction that was done on the 18th. Repeat it one more time so that people can ask questions there. And the whole idea is that we want to prepare people for the kind of activities that we're looking for volunteers for. And volunteering obviously is very narrow or very broad depending on how much you want to put into it. Some key things though that we're putting in place. One thing that we're working towards is a big event in December, and for that we're having a whole lot of tasks around training some of the volunteers, organizing ourselves in different subgroups, etc. Coming up with you know, directions for what each of these subgroups are working on. All of that kind of driven off volunteer needs and vision. And so moving on then on the calendar, in October we're doing the last M4SC training, that's the first training sessions. And then in December, on the 5th, we're showing the hosted in Palm Springs, the event, where we're getting together and basically reviewing kind of the first pass of what the research team have come up with. For those that are interested to participate as a volunteer for research, we have a sign-up page on our website. Melinda's been sending out a lot of those through email blasts already. The key things, of course, that we are looking for in a volunteer really is, input to, how does your company address these kind of things, but also, if you have had the opportunity to start looking at some of these capabilities, to put them in place, what were your experiences, what is your feedback on how it's worked so far, etc., for you. And so the key objective, of course, is to help for the volunteers, is to help us drive and come up with a set of tools in the framework that are kind of become the standard for supply chain management. And if you have more questions or you want to volunteer, then there's the contact information for myself, with still the same spelling error in there, I noticed. So contact Melinda Spring or C. Hunsje, but there's an S between the N and the C in my name. And of course on our website there's information also about the M4SC program itself under the resources tab within the website. And I think that's it for me, Melinda.
Okay, let me check here to see if I have anything else. I don't think I have any more questions right now. So I think we've covered everything that everybody. I've just got a lot of thank yous coming through. So I think that concludes what we have to cover for today. And I do have, like I said, I do have this recorded, and we will post it in multiple places on the YouTube and the website, in archives, as well as on the M4SC page. So thank you everyone for attending, especially since we have a very global audience, and I know that some people are doing this in the middle of the night. So thank you everybody for being here, and hope to hear you on the next one. Casper, anything to add?
No, thank you. Until next time.
Okay, thank you. Good day, everybody.